The ocean has always held mystery and danger in equal measure. For centuries, ships have sailed these vast waters, carrying dreams, fortunes, and sometimes unspeakable nightmares. But what happens when the very vessels meant to provide luxury and escape become floating monuments to human greed, incompetence, and corruption? What happens when the promise of paradise transforms into a descent into chaos? Today, we're diving deep into the darkest corners of maritime history to expose the 5 worst cruise lines that have ever sailed the 7 seas. These aren't just stories of minor inconveniences or mediocre service. These are tales of criminal enterprises disguised as vacation companies, of cult-operated ships where passengers disappear into the night, of captains who abandon their vessels while hundreds remain trapped below deck, and of business ventures so catastrophically misguided that they destroyed lives and livelihoods in their wake. From vessels operated by totalitarian regimes smuggling narcotics and kidnapping innocent civilians, to cruise lines whose negligence sent ship after ship to the ocean floor, what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view the cruise industry. These stories have been buried, swept under the rug by corporate interests and government conspiracies, but the truth always finds a way to surface. So prepare yourself, because once you learn what really happens behind the glossy brochures and smiling crew members, you may never look at a cruise ship the same way again. This is the untold story of maritime horror, human suffering, and corporate catastrophe. This is the definitive account of the 5 worst cruise lines in history. Let us begin with perhaps the most sinister, most politically charged, and most utterly bizarre cruise operation ever conceived by human minds. A luxury cruise line owned and operated by one of the world's most brutal dictatorships. The year was 1992, and North Korea's supreme leader Kim Jong-il found himself with an unusual problem. For years, the regime had been operating a large passenger ferry called the Mangyongbong 92, named after Kim's birthplace. This wasn't just any ferry. This vessel had become the centerpiece of one of the most audacious criminal smuggling operations in modern history. The ship made regular runs between the North Korean port of Wonsan and various Japanese cities, ostensibly carrying passengers and cargo for legitimate trade purposes. But hidden within the hull, concealed in specially constructed compartments that would make any drug cartel envious, was something far more sinister. Intelligence agencies would later estimate that this single vessel was responsible for smuggling nearly $7 billion worth of pure methamphetamine into Japan over the course of several years. $7 billion. Let that number sink in for a moment. That's more than the GDP of some small nations, all flowing from crystallized poison manufactured in clandestine North Korean laboratories, shipped across the Sea of Japan, and distributed through the veins of Japanese society by an operation run directly by a foreign government. But the methamphetamine trade was only part of the horror associated with this vessel. Japanese investigators began documenting something even more disturbing. The ship was being used to facilitate the kidnapping and forced disappearance of Japanese citizens. Over 700 people, plucked from their normal lives, their families, their futures, and transported against their will to North Korea. Why would North Korea kidnap hundreds of Japanese citizens? The reasons varied, each more chilling than the last. Some were taken to serve as language instructors, forced to teach Japanese to North Korean spies who would later infiltrate Japan. Others were kidnapped simply because they possessed specific skills the regime needed. Engineers, technicians, specialists in various fields. Some were taken for even darker purposes, pressed into marriages with other kidnapped foreigners, or used in propaganda efforts to demonstrate North Korea's supposed superiority. The families of these victims spent years in anguish, not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, unable to even begin the grieving process because there was no closure, no answers, just a terrible void where a person used to be. And all of this was facilitated by this single vessel, this ferry that moved like a ghost between nations, carrying its cargo of drugs and human misery. But then, inevitably, the operation was exposed. Japanese authorities, working with international intelligence agencies, finally assembled enough evidence to understand the full scope of what was happening. The revelation sparked international outrage. Japan immediately banned the Mangyongbong 92 from its waters, effectively cutting off the regime's most profitable smuggling route. Now Kim Jong-il had a significant problem. He had this large passenger vessel, suddenly stripped of its criminal purpose, sitting idle in port. The ship required maintenance, a crew, and significant operating costs. But it could no longer fulfill its original function. To most rational leaders, this would have meant either scrapping the vessel or repurposing it for legitimate domestic use. But Kim Jong-il was not most leaders, and rationality was never his strong suit. Around this same time, the North Korean dictator had become aware of the explosive growth in the American cruise industry. Companies like Carnival and Royal Caribbean were experiencing unprecedented success, taking thousands of passengers on luxury voyages and generating enormous profits. The concept fascinated Kim. Here was an industry that seemed to print money, that took people on floating vacations and charged them premium prices for the privilege. In Kim Jong-il's mind, a plan began to form. If American cruise lines could succeed with their capitalist model, why couldn't North Korea do the same? After all, the country had a coastline. It had this large vessel that needed a purpose, and it could position itself as offering something unique, cruising in one of the world's most mysterious and closed-off nations. The fact that North Korea had virtually no tourism infrastructure, that the country was an international pariah, that it had just been caught running a massive drug-smuggling and kidnapping operation, and that most people would rather visit a maximum security prison than vacation in one of the world's most repressive regimes. None of these obvious problems seemed to register with the supreme leader, and so the order was given. Transform the Mangyongbong 92 from a smuggling vessel into a luxury cruise ship. The timeline was impossibly ambitious, just 1 week to complete the transformation. 1 week to convert a ferry used for hauling drugs and kidnapping victims into a vessel suitable for paying tourists seeking relaxation and luxury. The workers assigned to this project must have known it was doomed from the start. But in North Korea, you don't question the supreme leader's vision. You simply execute it to the best of your ability and pray that the inevitable failure doesn't result in your own disappearance. For 7 days and nights, workers scrambled to make the vessel presentable. Walls were painted over, new signs were installed. Attempts were made to create what might generously be called amenities. There was no time for proper planning, no budget for quality materials, no expertise in cruise ship design or hospitality, just frantic work driven by fear and the desperate hope that somehow, miraculously, this would work. When launch day arrived, the regime orchestrated a grand spectacle. Thousands of North Korean citizens were assembled at the port, required to attend and demonstrate enthusiasm for this glorious achievement of the dear leader. Flags waved, music played, and state television cameras captured what was presented as a historic moment for North Korea, the launch of its first luxury cruise line. The propaganda footage showed smiling faces and celebrations, but it couldn't capture what passengers would soon discover about the actual conditions aboard this luxury vessel. The first tourists aboard, likely members of the regime's elite, and perhaps a few brave or foolish foreigners, began to discover the reality behind the propaganda. What they found was nothing short of shocking. A vision of luxury that could only have emerged from the bizarre parallel universe of North Korean governance. The owner's suite, typically the crown jewel of any cruise ship. The accommodation reserved for the wealthiest passengers, seeking the ultimate in comfort and privacy, was a room containing 2 sets of bunk beds squeezed so tightly together that passengers could barely move between them. This wasn't a quirky design choice or an attempt at rustic charm. This was simply the best the regime could offer. A room that would have been rejected as inadequate in a budget hostel, now being presented as premium accommodation. But at least the owner's suite had beds. The standard cabins were even more surreal. Passengers booking these rooms found themselves in large common spaces containing 8 mattresses simply laid out on the floor. There were no beds, no privacy dividers, no personal space whatsoever. 8 strangers would share a single room, their mattresses side by side, moving and sliding across the floor with the motion of the ship. Imagine paying for a cruise vacation and discovering that your accommodation consists of a mattress on the floor in a room with 7 complete strangers. Imagine trying to sleep while the person next to you snores, while someone else gets up repeatedly during the night, while your mattress slowly slides toward the wall with each wave that rocks the ship. The bathroom situation was somehow even worse. The restrooms throughout the vessel had been nominally renovated, but renovated in North Korea apparently meant briefly looked at and declared acceptable. The toilets didn't function properly. They were constantly overflowing, creating a sanitation nightmare that would horrify any health inspector. The floors of the bathrooms were perpetually wet with substances that passengers tried very hard not to think about. The sinks presented their own unique horror. When passengers turned on the faucets, what emerged was not clear water but a thick, gooey brown substance that looked like something dredged from the bottom of a polluted harbor. The consistency was wrong. The color was wrong. Everything about it screamed, "Do not touch." Yet crew members insisted to concerned passengers that this substance was perfectly safe for washing. Think about that for a moment. You're on a cruise ship, supposedly on vacation, and you're being told that the brown sludge coming from the taps is safe to wash your hands and face with. You're being asked to trust the judgment of a regime that had just spent years smuggling methamphetamine and kidnapping people. To trust that they suddenly care about your health and safety. The crew members aboard this nightmare vessel deserve some recognition for their efforts, because unlike the regime leadership that conceived this disaster, the actual workers tried to make the best of an impossible situation. They weren't trained hospitality professionals. Most had likely never even been on a proper cruise ship, but they attempted to provide some form of entertainment and service. Karaoke nights were organized, giving passengers a chance to forget their surroundings for a few hours and sing away their despair. Someone actually managed to get a coffee machine working, a small miracle of determination and ingenuity that probably represented the highlight of the entire cruise experience. These crew members were trying to create moments of normalcy and enjoyment within a fundamentally broken operation, and there's something both admirable and deeply sad about that effort. But all the karaoke in the world couldn't salvage this doomed venture, and the cruise's ending was as disastrous as everything that had come before. As the Mangyongbong 92 approached port for what would turn out to be its final voyage as a cruise ship, something went catastrophically wrong. Whether it was due to inadequate training, faulty equipment, poor navigation, or simply the culmination of every shortcut and failure that had defined the entire operation, the ship crashed directly into a pier. The impact was severe enough to cause significant damage, and the sound of metal tearing and wood splintering became the final memory that passengers took away from their North Korean cruise experience. People who had endured days of overflowing toilets, brown water, sleeping on floors, and the general surreal horror of the voyage now found themselves in actual physical danger as the ship collided with solid ground. Miraculously, there were no reports of serious injuries from the crash, but that was beside the point. The collision was the final perfect punctuation mark on this entire absurd catastrophe. It was as if the universe itself was declaring that this experiment needed to end, and end immediately. The passengers who survived this ordeal and made it back to wherever they came from undoubtedly had stories they would tell for the rest of their lives, though one suspects many details were too bizarre or too disturbing to share with people who hadn't been there. How do you explain to someone what it's like to vacation in a totalitarian state on a former drug-smuggling vessel where the water runs brown and you sleep on a mattress on the floor with 7 strangers? And the tourists, unsurprisingly, did not return. There were no repeat customers, no word-of-mouth marketing success, no travel reviews praising the unique North Korean cruise experience. The regime's dreams of entering the international cruise market died right there at that pier, crushed as thoroughly as the vessel itself had been in the collision. The Mangyongbong 92 was retired from its brief and catastrophic career as a cruise ship, and Kim Jong-il's vision of a North Korean cruise empire was abandoned forever. The ship would eventually return to more mundane service, though it remained banned from Japanese waters. Its smuggling days finished. This entire episode stands as perhaps the most bizarre intersection of dictatorship, crime, and tourism in modern history. A vessel used for drug running and kidnapping, hastily converted into a luxury cruise ship by a regime with no understanding of hospitality or safety, crashing into a pier and ending an experiment that should never have begun. It's a story so strange that if it appeared in fiction, editors would reject it as too implausible. But the Mangyongbong 92, as horrifying as it was, might actually not be the worst cruise line on our list, because at least North Korea's cruise operation ended quickly, sparing the world from prolonged suffering. Our next entry represents a different kind of failure. A cruise line whose business model was so fundamentally flawed, so designed to extract money while providing as little value as possible, that it became a masterclass in how not to run a hospitality business. Welcome to the story of easyCruise, where the race to the bottom of the budget travel market finally hit rock bottom. The early 2000s were a revolutionary time for budget travel in Europe. A Greek-British entrepreneur named Stelios Hadjiioannou had built an empire on a simple premise: strip away all the frills, charge rock-bottom base prices, and make money by charging separately for every possible additional service. His airline, easyJet, had transformed European air travel by offering flights so cheap they seemed impossible, then making their profit by charging for checked bags, seat selection, food, drinks, and anything else they could itemize. The model was enormously successful. easyJet became one of Europe's largest airlines, and Hadjiioannou expanded the brand into other industries. Easy Hotel offered no-frills accommodation at minimal prices. Easy Car provided bare-bones rental vehicles. The pattern was consistent: low base price, charge for everything else, profit from volume. So when the time came to enter the cruise industry, the approach seemed obvious. Create easyCruise, apply the same ultra-budget model to ocean travel, and watch the money roll in. On paper, it made perfect sense. Cruising was traditionally an expensive luxury. But what if you could democratize it, make it accessible to budget travelers who had never been able to afford a cruise before? The vision was to offer cabin space for an extraordinarily low price, sometimes as little as a few dozen euros per night, and then charge separately for absolutely everything else. Want your room cleaned? That's extra. Need a towel? That'll cost you. Food, entertainment, activities all available for additional fees. The first easyCruise vessel launched in 2005, and from the moment passengers first stepped aboard, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong with this concept. The cabins were approximately 100 square feet, less than half the size of standard cruise ship accommodations. To put that in perspective, 100 square feet is roughly the size of a small walk-in closet or a prison cell. Now imagine trying to spend multiple days and nights in that space, with your luggage, with another person, if you're traveling with a companion, with all your belongings for the trip. The beds in these tiny rooms were placed so low to the floor that they were essentially mattresses with a minimal frame, positioned this way to create an illusion of more vertical space in the cramped quarters. Passengers found themselves practically rolling out of bed onto the floor, living in a space so confined that claustrophobia became a constant companion. But the size, while uncomfortable, wasn't the real problem. Plenty of people can tolerate small spaces for short periods if the price is right and the overall experience makes up for it. The real problem was everything else, the nickel and diming that turned what seemed like a bargain into an expensive exercise in frustration. Housekeeping, the basic cleaning of your room that is considered standard on virtually every cruise ship, hotel, and accommodation in the world, costs $25 per service on easyCruise. Think about that. You're already paying for the cruise. And if you want someone to clean your tiny cabin, you have to pay an additional fee that, over the course of a week-long cruise, could add up to more than you paid for the cabin itself. Towels, those basic necessities of hygiene and comfort, cost $15 each. Not a set of towels, each individual towel. Want one for showering? $15. Want another for the pool? Another $15. Over the course of a cruise, a family could easily spend hundreds of dollars just on towels, items that are included free on literally every other cruise line. Food options were limited and mostly required additional payment. Entertainment was sparse and often came with its own charges. The list went on and on, each additional fee building resentment and frustration among passengers who had thought they were getting a bargain but instead felt like they were being slowly bled dry. The experience of being an easyCruise passenger meant constantly making decisions about whether you could afford basic comforts, constantly calculating costs, constantly feeling like you were being exploited. This isn't a vacation. This is stress with ocean views. And then there was the design. The design of the ships themselves became another massive problem, one so significant that it would force the company into expensive and embarrassing reversals. easyCruise vessels were painted a shockingly bright, almost fluorescent orange. This wasn't a subtle coral or a pleasant peach tone. This was traffic cone orange, safety vest orange, the kind of orange that seems to vibrate and pulse when you look at it too long. The idea was probably to make the brand instantly recognizable, to create floating billboards for the easyCruise concept that would stand out in any harbor. But passengers absolutely hated it. They hated looking at it. They hated being associated with it. And they especially hated that the interior cabins were also painted in various shades of orange that created an oppressive, disorienting atmosphere. Imagine being in your already tiny cabin, surrounded by aggressive orange walls that seem to press in on you, feeling like you're trapped inside a traffic safety device. The complaints were immediate, vehement, and unrelenting. Passengers who had booked based on low prices found themselves in an environment so unpleasant that no amount of savings seemed worth it. Reviews were scathing. Social media posts mocked the garish appearance. The bright orange ships became floating symbols of everything wrong with the race-to-the-bottom approach to hospitality. Faced with this backlash, easyCruise made the expensive decision to repaint the vessels. Not just once, but multiple times. As they experimented with different color schemes trying to find something passengers wouldn't actively despise. Each repainting required taking ships out of service, paying for materials and labor, and losing revenue, all costs that undermined the ultra-budget business model. But the color scheme, while annoying, still wasn't the fatal flaw. The real problem was competition, and specifically one competitor that was demolishing easyCruise's entire value proposition. MSC Cruises, an Italian-Swiss cruise line, had been expanding aggressively throughout the Mediterranean around the same time easyCruise launched. And MSC had figured out something crucial. You could offer budget-friendly prices without torturing your passengers with endless additional fees and substandard conditions. MSC was operating much larger ships with proper-sized cabins, and they were offering cruise packages at prices competitive with easyCruise's base rates. But, and this was the critical difference, MSC's prices included meals, included housekeeping, included towels, included basic entertainment and amenities. You paid one price and got an actual cruise experience, not a constant negotiation over what you could afford. For passengers trying to decide between the two options, the choice became obvious. Why would anyone choose to stay in a 100-square-foot orange cell where they'd be charged for towels and room cleaning, when for a similar total price, they could sail on a larger ship with better accommodations and everything included? The math simply didn't work. easyCruise's business model required that passengers either accept terrible conditions in exchange for low base prices or pay for additional services that would bring their total costs up to or above traditional cruise line prices anyway. But when MSC offered a better experience at competitive prices, with everything included, there was no reason to choose easyCruise. Travel agents, the crucial middlemen who booked the majority of cruise vacations, began actively steering clients away from easyCruise. Agents hated explaining the complex fee structure, hated dealing with client complaints after voyages, and hated being associated with a product that generated so much dissatisfaction. When clients asked about budget Mediterranean cruises, agents would immediately recommend MSC or other competitors, never even mentioning easyCruise as an option. Word of mouth, traditionally the most powerful marketing tool in the travel industry, turned completely against the brand. People who had sailed on easyCruise didn't recommend it to friends and family. They warned them away from it. Online reviews accumulated, painting a consistent picture of small cabins, nickel and diming, and an experience that felt more like punishment than vacation. Bookings declined steadily. Ships sailed with more and more empty cabins, unable to generate enough revenue to cover operating costs, even with their stripped-down service model. The company tried various adjustments, different routes, modified pricing structures, partnerships with hotels and other travel companies, but nothing could overcome the fundamental flaw in the concept. By 2009, just 4 years after launching with such optimistic projections, easyCruise was sold to a Greek shipping company. The new owners attempted to salvage something from the brand, but the damage was done. The name easyCruise had become synonymous with cheap in the worst sense of the word. Not affordable, not good value, just cheap, poor quality, disappointing. Within a few more years, operations ceased entirely. The ships were sold off, repainted, and integrated into other cruise lines where they could be operated under different brands without the poisonous association of the easyCruise name. The grand experiment in ultra-budget cruising was over, leaving behind nothing but cautionary tales and thousands of disappointed passengers who had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between a good deal and a cheap experience. Stelios Hadjiioannou, the entrepreneur behind the Easy brand empire, rarely mentions easyCruise in interviews today. It stands as the one significant failure in an otherwise successful career of budget travel ventures, a reminder that some industries and some experiences simply cannot be stripped down to bare essentials without losing everything that makes them worthwhile. The collapse of easyCruise teaches us something important about the cruise industry and hospitality in general. There's a minimum threshold of quality and service below which the entire premise of a vacation falls apart. People will accept smaller cabins or fewer amenities if the price is right. But they won't accept feeling exploited, squeezed for fees, and treated like walking wallets. They won't accept an environment so unpleasant that it generates stress rather than relieving it. But as bad as easyCruise was, as disappointing and frustrating as that experience must have been for thousands of passengers at least, it was just a failed business venture. Nobody was kidnapped. Nobody was imprisoned. Nobody's human rights were systematically violated. The worst that happened was people wasted money and vacation time on a subpar experience. Our next entry is different. Our next entry takes us into genuinely dark territory, into a cruise operation that isn't just poorly run or overpriced, but is actively dangerous, operated by an organization with a documented history of abuse, exploitation, and destruction of lives. This is a ship where passengers don't just experience disappointment, they disappear. This is the Freewinds, the cruise ship owned and operated by the Church of Scientology. From the outside, the Freewinds looks like a perfectly normal cruise ship. It's a modest vessel, not enormous by modern standards, but equipped with the typical amenities you'd expect: a swimming pool, a theater, dining facilities, cabins, and public spaces. If you saw it docked in port, you'd have no particular reason to think it was anything other than a small cruise ship serving a niche market. But this ship is not normal. This ship is, according to Scientology's own teachings, the holiest place in their entire religion. The location where the highest levels of spiritual advancement occur. The vessel that represents the pinnacle of their beliefs and practices. To understand why this matters, you need to understand something about Scientology itself. This is not a conventional religion. This is an organization that has been convicted of fraud and conspiracy in multiple countries, that has been characterized by numerous former members as a dangerous cult that destroys families and exploits vulnerable people, that has a documented pattern of aggressive litigation against critics and enemies. Scientology was founded by science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard in the 1950s, based on ideas from his book Dianetics. The core premise involves the belief that humans are immortal spiritual beings called thetans, who have lived through countless past lives and are burdened by traumatic experiences from those lives. Through a process called auditing, a form of counseling using a device called an e-meter, members believe they can clear away these traumas and achieve higher states of spiritual awareness. This might sound relatively harmless, if unusual, but the reality is far darker. Scientology operates on a tiered system where members must pay increasing amounts of money to access higher levels of teaching. These costs can easily reach hundreds of thousands of dollars over a lifetime of involvement. Former members describe intense pressure to donate, to cut off contact with family members who criticize the church, to work for church organizations for minimal or no pay, and to submit to punishments if they question or violate church rules. The Freewinds is where members go to receive the highest level of auditing, called OT8, Operating Thetan Level 8. To reach this point, A member has already spent years in Scientology and hundreds of thousands of dollars on previous levels. The opportunity to complete OT8 on the Freewinds is presented as the ultimate achievement, the culmination of their spiritual journey. Members pay thousands of dollars for the privilege of boarding this vessel and spending weeks undergoing intensive auditing sessions. They're told this will unlock the final secrets of existence, that they'll achieve abilities and awareness beyond anything available to ordinary humans. The isolation of being on a ship at sea, surrounded only by other Scientologists, cut off from outside communication and influence, creates a perfect environment for the church to maintain absolute control. The ship is entirely staffed by members of the Sea Organization, Scientology's most dedicated and exploited group. Sea Org members are the church's paramilitary religious order, recognizable by their naval-style uniforms and their absolute commitment to Scientology's goals. When someone joins the Sea Org, they sign a contract, and this is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. They sign a contract for 1 billion years. 1 billion years. This contract is meant to cover not just their current lifetime, but all their future reincarnations as well, binding them to service to Scientology for eternity. It's simultaneously absurd and deeply disturbing, a document that reveals the church's totalitarian mentality and its expectation of complete, eternal submission from its most devoted followers. Sea Org members work brutal hours for wages that are incomprehensible in any rational economic system. Former members report earning approximately 42 cents per hour for work that often extends 16 hours a day or more, 7 days a week. 42 cents per hour. That's not even minimum wage in the poorest developing nations. That's exploitation that would make sweatshop operators blush. On the Freewinds, Sea Org members serve as crew, working in food service, maintenance, administrative roles, and as auditors conducting the spiritual counseling sessions. They live in cramped quarters, work exhausting hours, and are kept in a state of complete isolation from the outside world. The ship is their prison, though they're told it's their privilege and their duty. Dozens of former crew members have come forward over the years with harrowing accounts of life aboard the Freewinds. They describe a culture of fear and punishment, where any questioning of authority or expression of doubt leads to severe consequences. When crew members express a desire to leave, they're subjected to something called security checking, intensive interrogation sessions designed to find crimes and overts that supposedly explain their desire to escape. If they persist in wanting to leave, they're often assigned to the ship's engine room or other areas for hard manual labor as punishment, working in dangerous, sweltering conditions for days or weeks, until they either give up their desire to leave or are finally allowed to disembark. Some former members report being essentially imprisoned on the ship, unable to leave even when docked in port, watched constantly to prevent escape. Phone calls are monitored, mail is screened, and any communication with family or friends outside Scientology is restricted or forbidden. But the crew members, as abused as they are still Scientologists who theoretically volunteered for the Sea Org, however much pressure and manipulation was involved in that decision. The passengers present an even more disturbing dimension to this story. Former passengers have reported being effectively kidnapped by crew members when they expressed doubts about Scientology or refused to make additional donations. Several accounts describe individuals who wanted to leave the ship and return home, only to be prevented from doing so, confined to cabins, and subjected to intensive ethics handling sessions designed to bring them back into compliance. One particularly chilling pattern involves passengers who arrive on the ship with significant wealth or assets. Former members describe aggressive pressure campaigns where these individuals are isolated, subjected to intensive auditing that's designed to make them emotionally vulnerable, and then pressured to sign over large donations, property deeds, or other assets to the church. Those who resist face psychological warfare, threats of being declared a suppressive person, which would result in their Scientologist friends and family being required to cut all contact with them forever. Imagine being on a ship, miles from shore, surrounded entirely by members of an organization that has demonstrated its willingness to destroy people who oppose it, being told that unless you donate your life savings or sign over your property, you'll lose everyone you care about. Imagine the psychological pressure of that situation, the helplessness, the terror, And if you think you could just call for help, remember that communication with the outside world is controlled by the church. Your phone doesn't work in the middle of the ocean. The ship's communication systems are operated by Sea Org members. There is no one to call, no one to help you, no authority figure who isn't part of the organization that's holding you. Several former members have described the Freewinds as essentially a floating prison, a place where Scientology can isolate, control, and exploit people far from the reach of law enforcement or media scrutiny. At sea, in international waters, normal rules and protections don't apply in the same way. The church operates with impunity. Celebrity Scientologists, the public face of the organization like Tom Cruise and others, have reportedly visited the Freewinds for events and celebrations. For them, the experience is completely different. Luxury accommodations, celebrations, parties, all the trappings of VIP treatment. These celebrities serve as propaganda tools, their positive experiences used to deflect from the abuse happening to ordinary members and crew. The contrast is sickening. While Tom Cruise enjoys champagne and celebration, crew members below deck are working for 42 cents an hour in dangerous conditions, unable to leave, separated from their families, trapped in a billion-year contract they signed when they were too young or too manipulated to understand what it meant. The Freewinds has been plagued by safety issues that have kept it docked for extended periods. After the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, the ship was ordered to remain in port due to failing numerous safety inspections. Reports suggested problems with asbestos contamination, mechanical failures, and other serious hazards that made the vessel potentially unsafe for passengers and crew. As of the most recent information available, the ship remained docked, unable to sail, a floating monument to Scientology's corruption and abuse. Whether it will ever sail again remains uncertain, though many former members and critics hope it never does. That this particular instrument of exploitation and control remains permanently out of commission. The Freewinds represent something uniquely disturbing in the world of cruise operations, a vessel that exists not to provide vacations or transport, but to serve as a tool of psychological manipulation and financial exploitation by an organization that operates more like an authoritarian regime than a church. The horrors of this ship aren't accidents or failures of management. They're features, deliberately designed elements of a system built to control and exploit people. But as dark as the Freewinds story is, as much suffering as has occurred on that vessel, at least it only involves one ship. Our next two entries involve cruise lines whose failures and negligence affected far more people across multiple vessels and years of operation. First, let's examine a cruise line that failed not through malice or exploitation, but through a business concept so fundamentally misguided that it collapsed almost immediately upon contact with reality. This is the story of Fathom, the volunteer vacation cruise line that nobody wanted. Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company, has a long history of acquiring and launching subsidiary brands to serve different market segments. Carnival Cruise Line serves the mass market. Holland America targets older passengers. Princess appeals to couples. Cunard offers luxury transatlantic crossings. Each brand has its niche, its target demographic, its reason for existing. In 2015, Carnival executives became intrigued by a growing trend in the travel industry, voluntourism, the concept of combining vacation travel with volunteer work in developing communities. Wealthy professionals were increasingly interested in travel experiences that felt meaningful, that contributed something positive, that provided more than just relaxation and entertainment. Market research suggested there was an underserved demographic of socially conscious travelers who wanted their tourism dollars to make a difference. These were people who felt guilty about traditional vacations, who wanted to help communities in need, who craved experiences that combined pleasure with purpose. Carnival decided to launch Fathom as a cruise line specifically designed for this market. The concept seemed sound. Take passengers on cruises to developing countries in the Caribbean. And instead of just enjoying beaches and tourist attractions, they'd spend significant portions of each day volunteering in local communities. The vision was compelling. Imagine a cruise where you'd spend mornings building schools or teaching English to children, afternoons working in community gardens or soup kitchens, and evenings back on the ship enjoying entertainment and dining. You'd return home not just relaxed and tan, but fulfilled, knowing you'd made a tangible difference in people's lives. Carnival selected an older ship from its fleet, refurbished it with Fathom branding, and designed itineraries focused on the Dominican Republic. Passengers would sail from Florida, spend several days docked while they volunteered in various community projects, then return home feeling they'd contributed something meaningful. The marketing emphasized the transformative nature of the experience. This wasn't just a vacation. This was personal growth, cultural exchange, genuine connection with communities in need. The promotional materials featured images of smiling volunteers working alongside locals, of schools being painted, of meals being served to grateful families. And then Fathom launched, and reality immediately collided with the fantasy. The first and most fundamental problem was price. A week-long Fathom cruise cost several $1,000s per person, prices comparable to traditional cruise vacations. But on a traditional cruise, you're paying for relaxation, entertainment, luxury, and service. On Fathom, you were paying for the privilege of doing manual labor. Think about that from a potential customer's perspective. You work all year at your job, you save up for a vacation, and now you're being asked to spend thousands of dollars to go work on your vacation. You're being asked to pay premium prices to paint schools, serve food, do physical labor in Caribbean heat and humidity. For most people, this simply didn't make sense. If you want to volunteer, there are countless organizations that will let you do so for free or for minimal costs that cover room and board. Why would you pay cruise ship prices to do the same work? The target demographic, affluent professionals who wanted meaningful travel, turned out to be far smaller than Carnival had projected. And even among that group, most preferred other options. They'd rather donate money directly to effective charities and take a traditional vacation, or they'd choose volunteer programs designed specifically for volunteerism that cost a fraction of Fathom's prices. Travel agents, those crucial intermediaries who book the majority of cruise vacations, struggled immensely to sell Fathom cruises. Try to imagine the sales pitch. So you'll pay about $4,000, sail to the Dominican Republic, and then spend your days doing construction work and food service. Yes, you're paying to work. No, I don't understand it either. Agents reported that when they mentioned Fathom to clients, the typical reaction was confusion or outright laughter. Even clients who were interested in socially responsible travel usually decided that the price-to-value ratio didn't work, that they could contribute more effectively and have a better experience through other means. Bookings were catastrophic from the start. Ships sailed significantly under capacity, with empty cabins representing lost revenue that made the entire operation financially unsustainable. The volunteer projects in the Dominican Republic were designed around having large numbers of participants. So when ships arrived with only a fraction of expected passengers, the impact was diluted, and the logistics became awkward. Carnival tried various adjustments. They modified the itineraries, reduced the amount of required volunteer time, added more traditional cruise activities and entertainment to make the experience more balanced. But these changes only made the concept more confused. If you're reducing the volunteer component and adding more traditional cruise features, what exactly is Fathom offering that's different from a regular cruise that happens to include an optional shore excursion for volunteer work? The media coverage was brutal. Travel writers and industry analysts openly questioned the concept, pointed out the obvious contradictions, and wondered what Carnival had been thinking. Social media commentary was even harsher, with people mocking the idea of paying thousands of dollars to volunteer. Just 1 year after launching with such optimistic projections and noble intentions, Carnival announced that Fathom would be discontinued as a standalone brand. The ships were reassigned to other Carnival subsidiaries. The Fathom branding was quietly retired, and the entire experiment was over. Cruises that had been booked months in advance were canceled, leaving passengers who actually were interested in the concept disappointed and scrambling to find alternatives. Refunds were processed, apologies were issued, and Carnival moved on as if Fathom had never existed. The collapse of Fathom wasn't a tragedy in human terms. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was exploited. Nobody suffered beyond the inconvenience of canceled plans and the disappointment of an unfulfilled concept. But it represents a spectacular failure of market understanding. A case where a company completely misjudged what customers wanted and how much they'd be willing to pay for it. The fundamental lesson of Fathom is simple. People don't want to pay premium prices to work on their vacations. If you want to create a volunteer-oriented travel experience, it needs to be priced appropriately for what you're actually offering. Charging cruise ship prices for an experience that involves significant manual labor is asking customers to pay for the privilege of providing free labor to your chosen charitable causes. There's something almost offensive about the Fathom concept when you examine it closely. The company was essentially selling wealthy Americans the experience of feeling good about themselves by doing work that could have been done by local workers who needed the employment. Instead of paying those workers a fair wage to build schools and staff soup kitchens, Carnival was charging tourists thousands of dollars to do that work themselves. Former volunteers from actual volunteer organizations pointed out this contradiction. Fathom was potentially taking employment opportunities away from local communities while charging participants premium prices for the experience. It was colonialism repackaged as social consciousness, wealth on display disguised as charity. But Fathom's failure, as embarrassing and expensive as it was for Carnival, still doesn't reach the level of our final entry. The worst cruise line in maritime history, an operation so catastrophically negligent that it sent multiple ships to the ocean floor and killed passengers through sheer incompetence and corporate malfeasance. This is the story of Epirotiki Cruises, the Greek cruise operator that turned the Mediterranean into a graveyard. Epirotiki Cruise Lines was founded in Greece and operated throughout the Mediterranean during the 1970s and 1980s. For most of its existence, it was an unremarkable cruise operator, providing modest service on aging vessels to tourists who wanted to visit Greek islands and other Mediterranean destinations. The company wasn't prestigious or luxury-oriented, but it was functional ships, departed on schedule. Passengers got where they were going, and for many years, Epirotiki maintained an acceptable if unspectacular safety record. But in the early 1990s, something changed. Whether it was financial pressure, declining standards, inadequate maintenance, or simple catastrophic bad luck, Epirotiki entered a period where disaster followed disaster with terrifying regularity. Within just 30 months, less than 3 years, the company managed to sink not one, not two, but 3 cruise ships. 3 separate vessels, 3 separate sinkings, hundreds of passengers placed in mortal danger, lives lost, and a pattern of negligence so obvious that it shocked even the notoriously lax Greek maritime authorities. The first sinking was treated as a tragic accident. Ships do occasionally sink due to unforeseen circumstances, storms, equipment failures, unexpected hazards. The maritime industry investigated. Lessons were supposedly learned, and everyone moved on. The second sinking, occurring just months after the first, began raising serious questions. Was this company maintaining its vessels properly? Were captains being adequately trained? Was there systemic negligence that needed to be addressed? By the third sinking, it was undeniable this wasn't bad luck. This was a pattern of criminal negligence and complete institutional failure. One of these sinkings involved behavior so shocking, so utterly abandoning every principle of maritime law and basic human decency, that it remains one of the most infamous incidents in cruise ship history. The officers and captain of the vessel, as the ship began taking on water and listing dangerously, simply left. They didn't organize an evacuation. They didn't coordinate with rescue services. They didn't ensure passengers were safely in lifeboats. They just quietly sneaked away from the ship, boarded a lifeboat themselves, and rowed away while hundreds of passengers remained on board, unaware of how dire the situation had become. Imagine being a passenger on that ship. Something's wrong, the vessel is listing, alarms might be sounding, there's obvious distress. But you're waiting for the crew to give you instructions, to tell you what to do, to organize the evacuation that you know from movies and safety drills is supposed to happen in these situations. But no instructions come. No crew members appear to guide you. The ship continues listing further and further, and you begin to realize with mounting horror that you're on your own. In this particular sinking, it was actually the ship's onboard guitarist, a musician hired to provide entertainment for passengers who became the unlikely hero. When he realized the bridge was abandoned and nobody was coordinating rescue efforts, he made his way to the empty bridge and used the radio to call for a mayday himself. This musician, who had no training in maritime emergencies, no authority to command the vessel, no preparation for this role, became the de facto leader simply because every actual authority figure had fled. He stayed on the bridge, coordinating with approaching rescue vessels, helping organize passengers into lifeboats, doing the job that the captain and officers should have been doing. Thanks largely to his efforts and the quick response of nearby vessels that heard the mayday call, most passengers survived. But the psychological trauma of being abandoned by the very people whose job it was to protect you, of facing mortal danger while the captain snuck away to save himself, scarred survivors for life. Maritime law has held for centuries that the captain is the last person to leave a sinking ship. This isn't just tradition or courtesy, it's a recognition that the captain has ultimate responsibility for every person on board, that their duty to passengers and crew supersedes their own safety, that accepting command of a vessel means accepting the moral and legal obligation to protect everyone on it. The Epirotiki captain, who abandoned ship, violated every principle of maritime command, betrayed every passenger who had entrusted their safety to him, and disgraced his profession in a way that few seafarers in history have matched. And what did Epirotiki do when this became public? Did they fire this captain? Did they ban him from ever commanding a vessel again? Did they acknowledge that such behavior was absolutely unacceptable and ensure it would never happen again? No. In a decision that defies comprehension, Epirotiki blamed external factors, minimized the captain's abandonment of his post, and incredibly, actually rehired him. This captain, who had literally sneaked off a sinking ship while hundreds of passengers remained aboard, was given command of another Epirotiki vessel. He continued commanding Epirotiki ships until his retirement, his abandonment of passengers apparently viewed by company leadership as not particularly important or disqualifying. This decision reveals everything wrong with Epirotiki's corporate culture. Safety wasn't a priority, passenger welfare wasn't a priority, basic decency and professional standards weren't priorities. The only thing that mattered was keeping ships operating as cheaply as possible, regardless of the human cost. After the third sinking, with international media attention focused on their catastrophic safety record, with insurance companies refusing to cover their vessels, with passengers canceling bookings en masse, Epirotiki faced the end of their operations. But rather than simply shut down and accept responsibility, the company attempted something audaciously desperate. They tried to rebrand and relaunch, as if their history of sinking ships was just a minor setback that could be overcome with fresh paint and a new name. The rebranding effort was pathetic and transparent. The new brand name was barely different. The ships were the same aging vessels that had proven themselves unseaworthy, and the management team included many of the same people who had presided over the disasters. Unsurprisingly, this rebranding attempt failed immediately and completely. Nobody was fooled. Travel agents wouldn't book passages. Passengers wouldn't sail. Maritime authorities maintained intense scrutiny. And insurance remained prohibitively expensive or simply unavailable. The attempt to rebrand sank faster than the company's ships had, which is saying something. Within months, Epirotiki ceased operations entirely. The vessels were sold off to other operators, and one of the worst chapters in cruise line history finally ended. Epirotiki's legacy is one of almost unimaginable negligence, of systematic failures that cost lives and traumatized thousands of passengers who survived harrowing sinkings. The company demonstrated that even in an industry as heavily regulated as maritime passenger transport, catastrophic failure is possible when profit is prioritized over safety and when corporate leadership refuses to accept accountability. The 3 sinkings in 30 months stand as a record that, mercifully, no other cruise line has approached. No other operator has managed to lose 3 ships in such a short period, and the regulations and oversight that were strengthened in response to Epirotiki's failures have helped ensure that such a pattern cannot easily repeat. But the memory of those sinkings, especially the image of a captain sneaking away while passengers remained in danger, remains burned into the collective consciousness of the maritime industry. It stands as the ultimate cautionary tale the definitive example of what happens when cruise operators abandon their fundamental responsibilities. So, there you have it, the 5 worst cruise lines in maritime history. From North Korea's drug-smuggling vessel hastily converted into a nightmare cruise ship, to easyCruise's exploitation of budget travelers, to Scientology's floating prison, to Fathom's tone-deaf volunteer vacation concept, and finally to Epirotiki's catastrophic pattern of sinking ships and abandoning passengers. Each represents a different kind of failure criminal enterprise, failed business model, cult exploitation, market misjudgment, and lethal negligence. Together, they paint a picture of how badly cruise operations can go wrong when proper safeguards, ethical standards, and basic competence are absent. These stories serve as reminders that behind the glossy marketing of the cruise industry, behind the promises of luxury and adventure, there exists the potential for disaster, exploitation, and tragedy. The vast majority of cruise lines operate safely and responsibly, providing millions of passengers with positive vacation experiences every year. But these 5 remind us that we should never take that safety and responsibility for granted, that we should research before we book, that we should hold cruise operators accountable to the highest standards, and that we should remember the victims of these disasters, those who were kidnapped by North Korea, those who felt exploited by easyCruise, those who were abused by Scientology on the Freewinds, those who were disappointed by Fathom's failure, and especially those who died or were traumatized by Epirotiki's negligence. The ocean is vast and unforgiving. Ships that venture onto it carry a sacred responsibility to those who sail aboard them. When that responsibility is abandoned, the results are catastrophic. May we never forget these lessons, and may such disasters never be repeated.